Welcome, everybody, to the Illusion of Consensus podcast. I'm Professor Jay Bhattacharya, and I'm delighted to have with me my friend Sharyl Attkisson, who is a very famous journalist and the author of a new book on the corruption of American society, the institutions of American society by the pharmaceutical industry. Sharyl was kind enough to interview me during the pandemic at a time when I was canceled, and so I'm so delighted to have the chance to talk with Sharyl about her new book, which just is a really incredible indictment on our healthcare system. Thank you, Sharyl, for joining.
Thanks for being here. You are mentioned in the book because you, as a journalist, I'm always looking for the best sources, and you don't know at the beginning of something like a new pandemic who they're going to be. But I correctly judged that you had credibility and chops, and that the things you were saying meshed with other scientists I trusted. And I'm really glad I relied on your information starting early on.
Thank you, Sharyl. We appreciate the kind words. But the book is such an interesting thing, because what the story of the book is that the pharmaceutical industry plays a incredibly corrupting role in basically almost every aspect of American life, with not much to show for it. American health is not much better. So I figured we organize our conversation around how this actually works. So what I wanted to start with your observations about how the pharmaceutical industry corrupts media. If you look on TV, there's ad after ad for some pharmaceutical product or another, often for rare diseases, and you wonder, why are they showing an ad to millions of people for a disease that affects 2 or 3 people, or very few people? So I'd love to hear about your observations in the media space for how pharmaceutical interests corrupt media reporting.
Well, some people listening may be too young to remember that pharmaceutical drugs were not allowed to be having ads on television for most of my life anyway. It's a relatively new development. The drug companies lobbied hand in hand with broadcast networks who would be making money off the ads for Congress and the FDA to loosen the rules. We're one of the few countries that allows this sort of advertising. And in the early 2000s, when CBS News was assigning me as an investigative correspondent to cover various dangerous drug and medical corruption scandals, they, meaning CBS, were welcoming these stories. They impact so many people. And then there became this big chill. The stories were no longer accepted or wanted at certain corners of the corporate structure. The news people still liked these stories and were asking for them, but there were clear conflicts that started to arise and some pushback and interference. In retrospect, I see that coincides with the partnership that we developed with the drug companies for advertising. And today, it's gotten to be where they don't even need to step in and overtly censor news stories. First of all, their interests now work inside the newsrooms. It's not just an outside influence. But secondly, journalists self-censor. They now understand which stories will and won't make headlines and which their bosses will kind of discourage or edit too much and which ones they won't. So I argue that in today's media environment, it's so corrupted that it's not even necessary for the pharmaceutical industry to do much, other than they're ubiquitous with the ads and everybody knows where the money's coming from.
I mean, it's actually really striking how many pharmaceutical ads there are now. I mean, I don't typically watch TV these days, but when I watch some sporting event, I was just struck by how many there are. I don't remember being inundated with so many pharmaceutical ads, back when I was more of a regular TV watcher. And I just, if that's normally there's supposed to be this firewall, right? Maybe I'm being entirely too naive. In fact, I know I am, between the advertisers and the editorial staff on in media. But it really just, that really it seems to have like dissolved if there ever was one.
Well, even the New York Times some years ago made a shocking announcement that they believe this native advertising, not just for pharmaceutical industry, but for others, where they would work in promotional content and it would look like a news story. There would be sort of one and the same, that viewers didn't and readers didn't mind that at all. And I'm thinking, well, because they don't know it. You've hidden that that's an ad. Native advertising means it's worked into the conversation or the news article in a way that's designed to be somewhat invisible to readers who think they're reading a news article. I think that was a terrible trend. And it's pretty common now that this is blended together in a way that they're hard to separate. And when you talk about I've thought the same thing you have about these weird, rare illnesses that I'm thinking, how can the drug companies be making money advertising this to everybody? But I think it's just a matter of pouring money into the system of news and broadcasters and corporate information so that, again, the corporations are so reliant upon the drug industry. They understand what would happen if they reported what would seem like negative things about the medicine.
There is a history though of solid reporting, but I think you have to go back a ways on medical scandals, right? So I'm thinking about the coverage of the Vioxx scandal, right? The Vioxx was this drug that was put out, I think, by Merck that was marketed to patients for pain relief. It's like an alternative to Advil or something. But with the idea that with the marketing slogan that it reduce the risk of GI bleeds, stomach bleeds, because that is a side effect of some of these pain relievers like aspirin. There was a scientist who found that actually a doctor who found that actually there was an elevated risk of cardiovascular events, strokes, heart attacks, and so on, that happened rarely, but did happen. That was elevated for people who took this, and as in the late 90s, I remember my mom asking me about Vioxx. It was on TV all the time, and I didn't know about the scandal. It hadn't been reported in the medical literature. Then I just finished medical school, and I told her to take it. I thought it was a safe drug. And then when I read the first reports about it, I told her to stop taking it. But it turned out that Merck went after the doctors that had revealed this side effect and hid this side effect from the regulators. An absolute scandal. But news media in the early 2000s were all over this when the scandal came out.
This is not an uncommon story. And my first assignment, actually, the LA Times, David Willman did the hard work, even though my reporting was credited with getting Resolin pulled from the market. Once I was assigned, I did probably like 12 weeks of stories almost every night uncovering information. He had done a lot of background. But that opened my eyes. It was the same thing. The drug maker allegedly hid obvious liver side effects for this diabetes medicine. My direct sources were the FDA scientists who had approved the medicine and had to try to figure out how these side effects had been hidden. But there were a lot of allegedly dangerous drugs we were investigating, and corruption and scandal, including at the FDA. But there was a turning point that I think the drug companies were being decimated by this coverage. Because you're right, the New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, I was covering this sort of thing, and they needed to do something to fight back. Congressional hearings were unearthing this. There are no more congressional hearings on this stuff anymore. And that's because they figured out a strategy after the early 2000 time period when we were uncovering all of this that would turn this formula around. And part of it lies in the advertising dollars that we talked about. And another part of the equation is taking over members of Congress, both parties. They are well-meaning members who work as Democrats and Republicans, but the party leadership at the top is conflicted on both sides. So now the committees, like the Energy and Commerce Committee that would normally and used to conduct oversight on allegedly dangerous drugs, they don't do that anymore because all those members of the committees collect their donations and fundraise from those corporations. And in turn, they end up serving the corporations. They make sure there aren't hearings on these topics. They're not serving our interests anymore. So this equation has been turned on its head since about the 2005 time period.
I mean, part of it also is the regulatory agencies, right? So the US FDA, I mean, it has a proud history, right? The history includes protecting Americans from thalidomide in the like 50s and 60s. Let's turn next to the regulatory agencies like the US FDA. I mean, the FDA has a long and proud history actually of protecting Americans from drugs that have these side effects. Like probably the most famous is this drug thalidomide that in the late 1950s was used throughout Europe for pregnant moms to address morning sickness. And it turned out it had this terrible side effect of causing birth defects in children. born to moms that took it while they were pregnant. The U.S. FDA actually, it was actually like a brave woman scientist at the FDA who blew the whistle on this, who like slowed the FDA down in approving it. And what happened was that the FDA protected Americans from this drug. There's a codicil to the story because it later on turned out the drug was quite useful for HIV patients who, generally they're not pregnant, but useful for like wasting and a lack of hunger and hunger. So it turned out to be proved later, but with a warning label not to put for women. But this was the proudest days of the FDA, really protecting the Americans from essentially drug companies that wanted just to sell drugs to millions and millions of people. Like, you want a drug that many women get pregnant, and it's great to be able to sell drugs to all of those women, right? But what happened to the FDA? Because what you're talking about is what these failures of to protect Americans. It's really a regulatory failure, isn't it?
It is, and part of that is capture at the FDA and the federal agencies by corporations in much the same way we've described our elected political figures have been captured and the media has been captured. There is, of course, the revolving door aspect, where I believe that there are people from the pharmaceutical industry that go on loan to the FDA to loosen rules and to cover certain things up, and then they go back to the industry. There was an example of one person who was hired in the legal department at FDA some years ago directly from a big pharmaceutical company, stayed there long enough to loosen up some rules that impacted the pharmaceutical company, and then left to go back to work for the pharmaceutical company. And I just think many of those at the top have gotten to be where they either hope to have jobs someday in the industry, or they came from industry, or they're trying to please certain political masters. Because if you talk to the scientists, there are amazing scientists at the FDA who still do great work, but they say they're not listened to anymore. There came a point in time, I'm not sure this is still the case today, I'll bet it is, where they were not allowed to present at the FDA scientific advisory meetings anymore. They used to present on a drug, and they would raise their questions about side effects and problems. But during this changeover that we're talking about, they were silenced. They were told that they could not get up and speak at meetings. And now, more often than not, the FDA is sort of like a partner with these corporate interests. One good example is the most recent approval of a drug called aducanumab for Alzheimer's, which every FDA advisor on the committee agreed didn't look like it worked and had serious safety issues, but the FDA made a joint presentation, the bureaucrats or the executives at FDA, with the drug company to the advisory committee, who said they'd never seen anything like this, and the FDA approved this medicine over the objection of every advisory board member. 2 members quit over this, by the way, and they're usually pretty pharmaceutical friendly, the people who serve on these boards, but they were so outraged by this. This is one recent example, but there are numerous ones where the FDA is not listening to its advisors. It's taking these unilateral actions that don't seem to be in the best interest of consumers and patients, but are in the best interest of the drug companies. So things have been turned on their head.
I mean, that drug was so important because it was so expensive and the market was so huge. It was basically to prevent, it was sold as preventing cognitive decline due to Alzheimer's disease. And so if it's approved by the FDA and then covered by Medicare, it essentially bankrupts the country.
That's right. So an analyst I spoke to for my TV show said just that if it were going to be used and covered by Medicare, the system could not survive the expense of this medicine. And, even the drug maker admitted it does not stop cognitive decline. Their best they could say, pulling from studies that were never completed, this is part of the outrage. They pulled from 2 studies that were stopped because they were considered futility stoppages, because if they had continued, they would show the drug didn't work. They went back with FDA and came back later and said, we were mistaken about those stopped studies, and we never completed them, but we did find some data. We were wrong. It does work. But the best they could come up with is it may slow some of the cognitive decline, not prevent it, may slow it down a bit in a way that even the professionals who treat Alzheimer's said would not be noticeable to the patient or his family. So, this was a very dubious approval, plus there were the side effects. And that was ultimately pulled off the market because Medicare wouldn't cover it. So there was no viable way for it to survive. But in a sequel, the same company made a similar drug that was then approved quickly under equally controversial circumstances that is now on the market and is covered by Medicare.
So what fraction of this is going to be a shocking answer, I know, because I think I know the answer, but it may shock the listeners. What fraction of the operating budget of the FDA is pharmaceutical company funded?
Well, I think they've said it's about half. And,
Half.
I think it's somewhere around half. I didn't look it up before this conversation, or at least half of maybe the drug approval budget that they have. So the history to that, my understanding is there was a time when the drug companies argued to Congress, and Congress agreed, look, it takes too long to get a drug approved. We could be saving lives and helping people, and certainly many drugs do that. So they devised a system under which the drug companies would help pay the cost to hire the people to expedite approval of drugs. It sounded like a great plan. The problem is the FDA now, with this arrangement where pharma pays for so much, they consider the pharmaceutical companies their customer, their stakeholder. That's what they call them in internal emails. They don't call us the stakeholders. They consult with them. We can't get information when we file Freedom of Information Act requests about potentially dangerous medicine and processes, but all that's being shared with the drug companies, even though FDA is supposed to work for us. They consider the companies their partners now. So this funding situation without firewalls or specifics has led to this, I think, conflicted dynamic where the FDA works with and in some cases works for the drug companies. The drug companies approve the press releases in many cases, write the press releases about why a drug really is safe or how to promote a vaccine, for example. This coordination is, by most analysts' indication, far too close and not in our best interests.
Do you remember during the pandemic, the FDA put out a very infamous tweet where some intern must have written it, where it said that y'all are not horses. Don't take ivermectin. I don't remember the exact, but it's something like that. It was a shocking tweet to me because the FDA doesn't give advice about which drugs you should or should not take. That's left to doctors, right? That's left to, and the CDC may make some recommendations, but they're just recommendations. They're not like they're not practice of medicine. The FDA shouldn't be allowed to practice medicine, right? And yet they did during the pandemic.
I think the tweet was something like, "Come on, y'all, you are not a horse, you are not a cow," and they had pictures of animals implying that you're taking animal medicine. And there's an addendum to that, about the court case?
I do. Why don't you tell the story, Sharyl?
Well, it was challenged by some of the doctors who were prescribing ivermectin legitimately, but were not allowed to have the prescriptions filled because there was this backlash from prescribing companies and from the government and so on. And finally, a lawsuit which took far too long, because that's how our court system works, judges found, a panel of judges said that the FDA, just like you said, should not be giving advice on a specific drug. And in fact, the wording they used, I took as a play on the tweet, "You are not a cow" or "you're not a horse." The judges wrote, "FDA is not a doctor." And they said that they overstepped their bounds in this tweet. And they also hid the fact or failed to disclose that ivermectin is a human drug. It's not just an animal drug. It's been a human drug for decades. It's been considered safe and effective. And that was crucial information obviously omitted from the tweet that was designed to try to keep people from using this particular medicine.
I mean, I find this episode really, really interesting because it sort of, sometimes you lift up a rock and things are crawling underneath. You say, okay, what is going on here? What motivated the FDA to go after a drug like ivermectin? I don't want to get into does it work or doesn't work. There's a big fight. It's a complicated literature, and I just to tell you, Sharyl, I don't know the full answer to it. I have some hypotheses, but it was certainly a reasonable thing for people to try and use in the days when we didn't have any real treatments for early on, and then a lot of doctors, people with a lot of experience were saying they're getting good results with it. What motivated the FDA to intervene in a situation like this, where it's as you said, Sharyl, completely accurately. It's a drug that's been used for a long time. In fact, a Nobel Prize was awarded for the basis of this drug. It's literally been used by billions of people safely around the world. Why did the FDA decide it was going to intervene on this drug in this way?
Well, I'll answer what I think in a moment, but I want people to understand it's an accepted process that when there is a new and novel virus like we had, that the smartest thing to do is to repurpose and look for existing drugs that might help. That's much faster than inventing new ones or waiting for a vaccine. So looking at hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin made perfect sense and was the logical thing to do, yet was so controversialized, and that had to be, based on my experience, an organized campaign that came from whatever interests were going to benefit from people not using ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. And that could either be the makers of alternate drugs such as remdesivir, which would be more expensive and more profitable for the company. That could be the makers of the vaccines that were not yet introduced, because if you have a good prophylactic or something that would prevent disease, then you cannot develop an emergency vaccine under our system. You're not supposed to. That's supposed to be sort of a last resort, because vaccines, like all medicine, have side effects, and you don't just rush approval of something if there's already something effective on the market. So it looks to me like somebody, and you have to follow the money to find out who, somebody did not want people to think or to believe or to find out that hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, very cheap generic drugs, might be effective for COVID prior to these vaccines coming out.
I mean, it struck me that the NIH, the U.S. National Institute of Health, and the Tony Fauci's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, they had billions of dollars and more during the pandemic that was given to do research appropriately, to do research on how to treat and prevent or to vaccine research and drug research. But they spent very little effort in 2020 trying to assess these inexpensive drugs. Instead, they rushed the approval of a drug like remdesivir with a very shoddy set of scientific studies to back them up very, very quickly, and waited for years before they actually ran trials on these repurposed, inexpensive, off-patent drugs. They really seemed like they were serving the interest of the pharmaceutical company much more than they were serving the interest of the American people.
Oh, I think there's no doubt that's the case, and we have history to go by that shows that would be the case. When you look at things that so defy common sense and medical norms, you have to, look to our recent experience, and I think that's a pretty safe assumption.
So the FDA also it was in charge of approving or not approving the COVID vaccines. I'm gonna skip the discussion about like the initial approval of the EUA of the vaccine. I want to jump to the boosters. The FDA's treatment of the boosters was, to my mind, shocking. The initial vaccine, they required a trial with tens of thousands of people with an endpoint that it's not the endpoint I would have picked, but the endpoint was prevention of symptomatic infection. I would have picked prevention of death or something, but whatever. It's at least something that's reasonable that you care about. I don't want to get COVID, and it's nice if I have a product that can safely prevent me from getting COVID. So as a clinical endpoint, that's great. But for the boosters, they put a different clinical endpoint. Did taking the booster increase your antibodies? Which is not a clinical endpoint I particularly care about. I care about if those antibodies protect me, for how long? Will I not get COVID? Will I not go to the hospital if I get COVID? Those kinds of things I care about. And yet the FDA rushed through the approval of the boosters in 2021, and also rushed through the approval of the vaccine for children and for adolescents. And there were two senior FDA officials who resigned over the rush job over the boosters. What did you observe in this episode, and how the FDA treated the vaccines, the COVID vaccines?
Well, this is pretty unusual, these resignations that we're seeing. There have been several on the advisory committees that we described, from the aducanumab and other medicines, and then over the COVID vaccine boosters and the child recommendations, to high-level executives who, to my knowledge, haven't been replaced to this day. So the political arm is still running that section. These are really red flags that somebody should be looking at in a position of authority and saying, the fact that these insiders are speaking out and leaving their posts over these things really, is just a huge tell that something's wrong. In the book I wrote about the change, sort of this gets at what you were talking about. CDC unilaterally changed decades, probably 200 years of our recognition of what it was to have a vaccine, changed that definition overnight without so much as a public discussion, a hearing, or a vote. Between September 1st and September 2nd, 2021, on the CDC website, they removed key words that define a vaccine as something that prevents disease and so on. And now, suddenly a vaccine is the thing that the COVID vaccines do, which isn't very much. It increases your antibodies. It makes you, show up that you may have some resistance. By the new definition, these vaccines work. Under the old definition that we all understood before CDC changed the definition, the vaccines don't work. So I think, as I've written, if you understand how this change can be made kind of secretly without much notice and without any kind of approval or discussion, you can start to understand how deep the corruption goes inside the CDC and the FDA.
The CDC has a panel that of scientific advisors who give them advice. The FDA approves the drug, and then the CDC can give advice to doctors about how to use the vaccines. They have a vaccine panel of nominally independent scientists. And at one point, the independent panel recommended against the use of the COVID vaccines in young people, in children, but was overruled by the CDC director. I don't think I've ever seen that happen, where the CDC director ignores the scientific advice given by advisors about the sort of the proper use of a vaccine.
Well, it's like the FDA ignoring its advisors. This seems to be a trend, and that's a very big deal. Why do you have your scientific advisors if the political arm is not going to take their advice? And even those advisory committees are problematic. As I reported a couple of years ago, this committee at CDC that you're referring to signed off on a recommendation that contained completely false information about what the original COVID vaccine studies showed regarding would the vaccines help people who'd already had COVID, or did they have enough natural immunity? And I will say lie, I hardly use that word because it requires intention, but now I think we know enough to say the CDC, in a paper that had to be written by the vaccine makers in my mind, lied about what the studies found, which encouraged people who probably already had immunity because they already had COVID to go out and get a vaccine that could give them side effects and that was more needed by people such as the elderly and high-risk groups at a time when we didn't have enough supply. So they created or worsened what could be considered a crisis by their misinformation. And when a congressman who happens to be smart enough, he's an MIT engineer, recorded CDC in these conversations as he asked questions about their misinformation, recorded these high-level officials and scientific advisors agreeing finally on the phone with him in these secretly recorded conversations that their information was completely wrong, but defending why they weren't going to change it and how confusing that would be to the public if they put the accurate information out. It's just shocking. And they finally, when Congressman Massey pressed them, changed this public data a little bit, but it still is misleading. And my big question is that the misinformation was signed off by, I think there was something like 12 members of this CDC expert committee. Did none of them read the original studies as I had and as Congressman Massey had? Do they just sign papers somebody else writes and not understand the data and the claims in it are wrong? I think this is a huge scandal, and nobody's been held to account for that.
I was tracking your reporting on this, and I was absolutely shocked because I actually had read the studies that were published in New England Journal over the COVID vaccines in 2020, and if you look at the studies carefully, they did in the trial have people that were enrolled that had COVID and recovered, but in the analysis of vaccine efficacy, they dropped those people. And you can completely understand why. If you've had COVID and recovered, you have substantial immunity. It's at least as good as a vaccine, probably better. So adding the vaccine on top of that, you may get some benefit, but it's going to be marginal relative to the benefit you've already got in a sense, because you've you've had COVID and recovered. I mean, it's not optimal, especially if you're older, to have COVID and at all, but it is a positive side effect of having had it that you have some immunity. The trial threw out those people when they were analyzing efficacy to make the efficacy numbers look better. And Tom Massey, Representative Massey, absolutely nailed them on this. He absolutely observed it correctly, read the study correctly. And the CDC, it elided over this distinction between people who had COVID and never had COVID before in its vaccine recommendation, and then stonewalled congressional oversight when they were called out on this.
Yep, that's right. And he was alone. I mean, you'd think the committees, more powerful committees would be looking into this and conducting oversight, but it's just there are members here and there that are not as beholden to the pharmaceutical industry that try to do what they can, but they can't get a lot done because these companies and federal agencies know they can just ignore these members of Congress and not much will happen.
Hi, everyone. A quick recommendation. I just saw a great film on YouTube called Medicating Normal. It's about the growing trend to medicate mental distress with powerful psychiatric drugs like Prozac, Xanax, Seroquel, and Adderall. For some people, once on these drugs, they're almost impossible to get off, and they have devastating side effects. The film tells the story of people whose lives were ruined by taking these common prescriptions. Watch a trailer and the award-winning film on medicatingnormal.com. That's Medicating Normal, medicating with an ing at the end, normal.com. Our show notes and newsletter will have information on how to find the film. There's also a YouTube channel. Don't miss it. Check out the link in the description below. Thanks.
So the CDC seems to me, so their problem seems to be that that they I mean, one of their problems seems to me to be that they so focused on trying to get simplified messaging, manipulating the behavior of the American people, that they often ignore basic scientific results. And natural immunity seems to be a real case, like a major case of this. They essentially denied the reality of immunity. I mean, during a pandemic where there was immunity, it's hard for me to. I can't. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around this because with the FDA, you can tell a story about it's half funded by pharma. There's this revolving door. But what motivates the CDC to do this? This kind of it's because it's harder to say it's just the pharmaceutical company interest.
Well, it's the same sort of political interest in revolving door. In the book, I talk about how these former CDC directors go on to, like Julie Gerberding, who presided over a lot of scandals such as the swine flu epidemic that wasn't, as I proved with my investigative reporting, pushing out an emergency vaccine for that ended up harming some people. She went on to head vaccines at Merck, and then she's left for another job that's allied and affiliated with the National Institutes of Health and the vaccine industry. All this funding and cross-pollination goes on between the industry and these nonprofits that sound like they're doing all this good and the federal agencies that make decisions on who gets the funding. So there are similar conflicts, even if the pharmaceutical industry is not directly funding a portion of the CDC budget. There are definitely still these direct similar kinds of ties.
So there's this revolving door, just like you described with the FDA, between the pharmaceutical industry and people who work at the CDC. The other thing about the CDC that I observed was just direct political influence on the decisions made by the CDC during the pandemic, right? So, for instance, on the issue of whether schools should open, which was a high priority. Schools should never have closed and should have been open in certainly by fall 2020. When President Biden came to power, the head of the CDC, his head of the CDC, a woman named Rochelle Walensky, she met with union leaders in deciding whether to make a recommendation, how strongly to make a recommendation to open schools. And the union leaders essentially rewrote the CDC guidelines about school reopening, making it much more difficult for schools to reopen. That kind of political, I mean, as you said, Sharyl, the congressional leaders, the both people really from both parties are beholden to pharmaceutical company interests, and you have here you had a political influence, a teachers union that heavily funds the Democratic Party, essentially rewriting rules about school reopening. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm naive, Cheryl, but I still can't not help but find that shocking. I mean, the CDC is supposed to be representing public health, not a narrow political interest.
I learned long ago when I was first starting to cover these issues, so many shocking things. Like you, I just thought they were making decisions in the best interest of individuals. But the CDC understands its job because of the propaganda and the influence the pharmaceutical industry has. The CDC thinks its job is to market vaccines to the public by and large. The autism epidemic, I won't say they don't care about it, but they act like they don't care about it other than to sort of cover up what the causes could be because there's no vaccine for it. If we could make a vaccine tomorrow for autism, they'd be pumping that out to everybody. But when there's not a vaccine they can pump out and promote, they don't think that's really their job. And so at all costs, they promote vaccines with false information such as the simple statement that vaccines are safe and effective. Well, that is an incomplete statement at best. Which vaccines? For which people? Certainly not the vaccines that have been pulled off the market for safety issues. Those are not safe and effective. Certainly not vaccines that some people have a personal intolerance for that may even kill them. Those aren't safe and effective for some individuals. The blanket statements designed to brainwash the public into thinking there is no downside to vaccines which have a wide variety of safety and necessity and effectiveness is, I just think, highly irresponsible. But they think, or they've been convinced that that is their job, sort of a marketing arm at any cost.
I mean, I think that's completely accurate. In this, I used to work with the FDA actually on vaccine safety, and my observation on that is like there are some excellent scientists there, but they're very, very slow to make a call that a vaccine is not safe. But in the past, when they made the call, they would pull the vaccines from the market. It's not accurate to say that any medical product is 100% safe. But the vaccine, the question is, just like with any medical product, what are the balance of benefits and harms? So again, to return to the COVID vaccine, there was a real signal for young men getting heart inflammation, myocarditis from taking the COVID vaccine, and yet the CDC still recommends that everyone in the United States, as young as 6 months old, get the COVID vaccine. Although the marginal benefit from it, is much lower than maybe it once was, and the harm, this myocarditis, especially a particular group of young men where they have such an elevated risk, it makes no sense from a medical point of view, and yet they're still recommending it. The safety signals no longer seem to move the CDC to make alterations that you would normally expect them to make.
And that's changed. I mean, the first vaccine I covered was right after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The government considered restarting the smallpox vaccination program and did so in a limited number of first responders and military. Pretty quickly, a handful of people died, including an NBC correspondent, David Bloom, and I broke the news that the military that he was embedded with as an NBC correspondent failed to properly report his death as was required as a potential side effect from the smallpox and also the anthrax vaccine. My reporting got that reported as an adverse event. But at the time, there were only a handful of myocarditis, by the way, heart inflammation, does this sound familiar? Blood clots, immune disorders, the deep vein thrombosis that David died from. But this program was stopped because the government admitted at that time, many years ago, that the risk was too much for the benefit when it came to the smallpox vaccine, which actually has more risk than most vaccines. I learned it's fairly unique in the risks that it can pose to people. So the equation may have been a little bit different. But even for something that they were so concerned about, which was, will terrorists use a biological weapon against us? That's smallpox. We need to have people vaccinated. They stopped that program because of a handful of adverse events back in the day. One more thing I learned, which you've probably known a long time, why did they don't do this anymore, why did they react to a fairly small sounding number of adverse events? Because scientists say each adverse event that we know about that gets reported reflects an unknown number of others that will never get reported. Anywhere from 10,000 to, believe it or not, 100,000 times more than what you see is actually occurring in the population but will never be recognized. So that's why they take seriously, or used to take seriously, if there were even 4, 5, or 12 deaths or adverse events among a big group of people taking a medicine or a vaccine.
It's interesting because I always thought about this vaccine safety work and responding to it by putting black box warnings on the vaccine for certain groups or pulling the vaccine and replacing it with a different one or whatever. I always thought of that as a pro-vaccine kind of approach. Right? If you have a regulatory agency that is honestly evaluating side effects, looking to understand where it's useful or not useful, sort of thinking carefully about the harms and benefits and balancing it in their recommendations. Even when they pull a vaccine, even when a vaccine is found to have side effects that they didn't originally anticipate, pulling it actually is a pro-vaccine thing because then it allows you to believe that you can have confidence in the other remaining vaccines that are recommended. Somehow it's been inverted where like an honest evaluation of the side effects of vaccines is somehow like now seen as an anti-vax, like even talking about it as an anti-vax thing, and it's just such an odd thing to me as someone who's worked on vaccine safety in my career.
Well, you may know this, but in the late 90s, as the government was covering up the links between vaccines and autism, as autism was exploding, there were internal email discussions between, I believe, an FDA official and a public health service official that said just that. A woman that worked for the government was arguing as they were discovering, in this case, there's many things that could be linking vaccines to autism, by the way, but one of the things they thought at the time could be the mercury, the dose of thimerosal preservative that was widely used in vaccines, still in some, not in as many. But the thought was at the time that, boy, we now know this is too big of a mercury load. And as was said in an email, the public will wonder why we at FDA or in the government did not do the 8th grade math necessary to understand that this toxic load basically that we're giving children in vaccines. The other side was being argued as these government officials discussed whether they should come clean and tell the public. The woman was saying we should. And the other side was saying, no, this will destroy confidence in the vaccine program. And she argued just what you said. No, this preserves confidence in the vaccine program because there may be a momentary blip in parents who get their children vaccinated when they hear about this, but they'll understand that we're fixing the problem. And the blip won't be enough to impact our infectious disease coverage and will retain the confidence of the public. But if we don't address it, people will know something's going on and that we're not taking care of business, and that will destroy confidence in the program. I argue that's kind of where we are today. The government blames anti-vaxxers for destroying confidence in our vaccine program. The government did that. Through the very means that you've discussed, they could have preserved confidence in our vaccine program by acting extremely vigilant about how they consider things, and they've done just the opposite.
I mean, just to think about, again, back to the COVID vaccine, the confident proclamations by public health officials is like Tony Fauci, like Rochelle Walensky, essentially saying that if you take this COVID vaccine, this is like put yourself back in January 2020. And if you take this vaccine, you're not going to get COVID and you're not going to spread COVID. But of course, the data never showed that. It wasn't in the randomized trials, and of course, and the real world data never showed that. They essentially ended up having egg on their face, and I think it put egg on the face of the entirety of the U.S. public health establishment regarding all vaccines. I've never in my career seen such a level of skepticism about vaccines than I have now, and it's hard to argue when people can point to accurately that there'd been this overstatement of the benefits of the COVID vaccine in stopping you from getting and spreading COVID. And then of course on the back of that there were all these mandates where people lost their jobs over if they felt like they were forced to take the vaccine, and an underplaying of the harms of the vaccine, especially again to young men and also some others. So you have a situation where the public health establishment, which is its job is to do honest assessments, honestly evaluate the science behind these products, and then make the recommendations. People don't trust them anymore. Even on autism, I have to say I don't know the cause. I mean, I'm looking at this literature. I think it's a central mystery why autism rates are so high, and especially in children. And I don't know. I mean, just looking at this as a scientist, it still looks to me like a mystery. I haven't seen a smoking gun that says it's this or that, but it is a mystery that needs to be solved. And now we have a public health establishment that we can't trust to solve it.
Well, they don't even seem interested. I mean, I think the autism awareness group change its name to Autism Acceptance this past year. Some friends of mine told me. I mean, it's all about accepting diseases, all kinds of chronic diseases, rather than looking for the root causes. And I think that's a propaganda campaign because industries that influence us know that the root causes lie in multiple factors that could be, with a lot of attention, teased out. It's not, I don't think it's one thing based on the extensive research I've done. It's a combination of factors. Some children may have an undiagnosed mitochondrial disorder, which may be more common than we think. And when they get an immune challenge from a certain vaccine at a certain time in their life, they may get brain damage where other kids don't. They may have an additional toxic load of chemicals that come to them through the food, the chemicals that are in the food that we eat that we know are poisonous and endocrine disruptors and all kinds of problems. There are so many factors that can combine together, which actually benefits those who don't want you to pinpoint the causes. Because if you do a narrow study on one thing, first of all, a negative study will never be published, because why would the people who make the drug, who fund the studies, publish something that turns out negative? So they're designed to only publish positive studies. But these are things that are carefully controlled so that we don't look at the multi-causes behind some of our chronic diseases and disorders, which I think can be figured out. As Dr. Bernadine Healy, the former head of National Institutes of Health, said to me some years ago, there was an intentional decision by her colleagues at the Institute of Medicine at the time to not go down the road of looking at vaccines and autism, because she said there was expressed concern over what they would find. And that meant, the argument I heard off camera when I was covering this from government officials was, even if there were a link, we don't want to destroy confidence in the vaccine program. That'll be a resurgence of infectious diseases. And they will tell reporters that so that you don't report what you find out. And at first that worked with me. I'm like, I don't want a resurgence of infectious diseases. I better not report what I'm finding out. And then I did some critical thinking and thought, it's not my job to lie or censor to the public or omit information that I have just because I'm afraid how the public will react. That's up to CDC to manage. If they're selling a product to us that has issues that disturbs the public confidence, they have to figure out how to overcome that. That's not my responsibility as a journalist to keep the public from knowing truthful information about their health so that the CDC doesn't have to deal with these complicated problems. I have a little bit of news. You know the story I did on the Amish approach to COVID? So
I do. I remember. I followed very closely. I mean, the Amish did, and I mean, I learned this from your reporting, Sharyl. The Amish did quite well relative to what you would expect, given that they didn't mask, they didn't social distance. They met for church. They basically acted like they were human beings. I think they did work to protect their elderly, but other than that, I don't think they did much.
They didn't vaccinate. They didn't go to the hospital when they were sick. They didn't isolate, like you say. They stayed open. They made more money as a community that year in 2021 than they had ever made. So this was huge, either 2020 or /2021. Because, it's hard to find hard data because they didn't get COVID tests. They didn't go to the hospital. And when they die, there aren't autopsies saying they died of COVID or whatnot. But looking at the general death rates, we know one thing. They definitely didn't die in greater numbers. And I think there's evidence they died in far fewer numbers by letting COVID race through quickly rather than stretching it out. And they did have spikes during variants. They had spikes of illnesses and all, but they did nothing to stop it or to try to slow it, and it kind of would race through the community. Well, after this revelation, which made it seem like, boy, if they didn't fare any worse and they fared better without destroying their economy and their schools and without vaccinating and going to the hospital, then our approach was horrible compared to theirs. So a study comes out, federally funded, that, in my view, seeks to try to say that's not true. The headlines kind of acted like, these religious communities, look how they suffered with excess death rates, which I knew wasn't true. And as I dug into the federally funded study, it smacked of propaganda to me that there was some federal interest that decided, after my reporting and other people on this topic, we better come out with something, as they've done over time, to controversialize the Amish for not vaccinating and using medicine the way the rest of us do. So the study comes out, I dig into it, there's all kinds of flaws. It doesn't say what they say that it says. And in fact, the bottom line of their own study, where they're trying to pretend the Amish approach didn't work, when you look at what they said, that basically the Amish fared no worse. The way they put it, the Amish suffered a similar toll or death rate as the rest of America. And as I wrote to the journal when I challenged the study and the data, the selected data they use, the selected population they use, I said, even with your skewed sample, what you really found, you buried your headline, which was, if the Amish fared no worse for having done none of the CDC recommendations, then we really messed up for having shut everything down. So fast forward, this took a year of me just prodding, and they promised an investigation. And I just got word this week that they've issued all kinds of corrections to that study. So they've published corrections in the scientific study in the journal based on my challenges. Not good enough because, of course, most people won't see the corrections. The corrections are not clear. The title stays the same. I think people would still read it and their takeaway would be the same. But I'm glad that I forced an embarrassing correction of these scientists. One little addendum. What I really want to know is who pressed for this fake study to be done. I'm calling it a fake study in my opinion because I don't think the sample was, nothing was right about it. And they won't turn over the data. The freedom of information requests aren't answered. They say you're not allowed to know who the peer reviewers are because I'm like, who reviewed this? I'm just a layperson and I see all these flaws. They won't tell you who those peer reviews are. So the federal government can take our tax money and run it to a university, some cases a private university like Columbia, who then says, we're not subject to FOIA requests. We won't release our data, even though scientific studies that we paid for are not considered legitimate unless the data is public and they're replicable. They're just throwing out all the rules of real science in order to get propaganda across to the American public.
I mean, that's it's interesting because like the data from the Amish that you reported on, Sharyl, through the pandemic, they were consistent with other data, right? So for instance, if you think that lockdowns and school closures were needed to suppress the pandemic, the mortality during the pandemic, how do you explain Sweden, which didn't close schools for kids under 16 and didn't lock down? They had, reasonable measures to try to protect older people, but their all-cause excess deaths is the lowest in Europe, far lower than the United States, far lower than Canada. Since the start of the pandemic. The same thing with if you compare California and Florida, right? Florida opened schools very famously. You had by May of 2020, you had Ron DeSantis saying that Disney World was going to stay open, and Disneyland stayed closed for years. Florida has lower all-cause excess deaths than California since the start of the pandemic.
Well, you're always looking for cues when you're me and you're trying to develop sources early on, and I found you. But I also found some other great sources, including some inside the government who worked on developing the COVID-19 vaccines and told me way before they were out. This is probably an almost verbatim quote. RNA vaccines don't work very well and don't last very long. And if they did, we'd have a vaccine for AIDS because we've been working on that for 50 years. So I knew off the bat that if they came out with a vaccine, these guys who helped work on it said you will need a booster if it works pretty quickly. You will need boosters. And they also were saying initially to the school thing that kids, these government scientists, top level, kids don't need the vaccine. COVID doesn't hurt the kids. And in fact, healthy adults, they didn't think needed anything because they should just go about their lives and get the exposure and get the natural immunity. Then all of a sudden, as you know, this turn happened, and the government, which even itself had publicly said children need not fear by and large, suddenly put out all this information that made it sound like your children were going to die without the vaccines. And in my book, there's a chapter where I list all of the statistical, I'll say, mistakes that CDC made and put out that have been proven false, that all happened to exaggerate the severity of COVID in children right about the time the CDC wanted to start promoting the COVID shots for children. It looks like, again, an organized propaganda campaign to put out data and material to scare everybody so that they could sell a product.
I mean, the data out of Africa should have made us understand the futility of that approach, because it was really tough to get vaccines to Africa. With you look at the mortality rate from COVID, Africa is actually quite low, and the reason is simple: it's because they have a very young population. Only less than 3%, I think, is over the age of 65. The exaggeration of the risk of COVID to children, it's been persistent through the whole pandemic, and the CDC has played a big role in that, unfortunately. Okay, we actually, there's one other thing I wanted to get to, and it's a major theme of your book. So I'm sorry to wait till the last bit. It's not just media that the pharmaceutical companies corrupt. It's not just government, and like the representatives and senators and so on, or political parties. It's not just the regulatory agencies, but it's actually doctors themselves. You make the case, Sharyl, that doctors themselves are corrupted by the pharmaceutical company money.
I think people have long asked themselves the question that I'm asking. As our chronic health disorders have exploded in frequency, why do our doctors and why does the medical establishment, why are they not declaring emergencies over what's happening? This is so massive. Why do they seem not to notice? Either they're pretending not to notice, which is bad enough, or they really don't notice, which is terrible. And I think a lot of the roots of that can be found how doctors are taught beginning even in med school. And one example of this is many doctors refer to, or med students, the Merck manual, which is a reference book used in med school. I read accounts from some medical school students who said this was their go-to for so much important information. Yes, it's written by Merck, the drug and vaccine maker that has paid hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps billions, in fines over the years for alleged fraud and corruption and bribing doctors and paying kickbacks and marketing dangerous drugs and hiding side effects. I mean, this company is writing the textbook and telling young doctors what to think. So I decided to take a look inside the Merck manual, even though Merck claims that its pharmaceutical profit division is separate from its editorial doctor book writing division. But we talked about self-censorship. I'm sure that people who work for Merck writing the manual understand they probably can't write something in there about Merck's controversies and hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. Doctors should be taught this so that they understand when they're hearing marketing from a drug company. The studies may be ghostwritten. There may be conflicts of interest, but instead they're given this whitewashed view. So I found in the Merck manual a couple of specific examples, such as I looked up their vaccine Gardasil, the HPV vaccine, which is very controversial, has a lot of lawsuits. Nothing about the controversy I could find in there, number one. But number two, audaciously, doctors are told there are no serious side effects reported, which is completely false and defies Merck's own label on the vaccine. The FDA-approved label lists dozens and dozens of serious side effects, including everything from nerve damage and paralysis to death. But doctors are taught there's no serious side effects reported. How can this be? So I think that's just one example how doctors they're taught and massaged early on not to ask about side effects, not to report them to the federal database. They kind of poo-poo if a patient even figures something like that out and tries to tell the doctor. Oftentimes, I think the doctor brushes them off. They're not told to pay attention to this sort of thing.
I remember in the 90s when I was a medical student, reading the medical journals, like the Journal of the American Medical Association, and back in the old days when besides all the gray hair, Sharyl, it was actually physical copies, and there were ads for pharmaceutical products in the middle of the Journal of the American Medical Association, one of the top medical journals in the world. How trustworthy are the medical journals? How well are they protected against this kind of pharmaceutical company influence?
Well, sadly, they're not. So the studies are conflicted in ways where the pharmaceutical industry controls the studies and the terms and how they turn out. And then the journals, which are supposed to do due diligence before they're published, are not able to do that. Don't take my word for it. This is the word of the former editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. Marcia Angel, who said that she tried to do due diligence so that the studies could be relied upon, but she lost that battle because the pharmaceutical industry was so powerful at the New England Journal of Medicine. The current editor-in-chief of the British journal Lancet famously wrote an editorial a couple of years ago that said, I think his words were, half the science in his own journal and all the journals are not to be believed because the pharmaceutical industry so controls the science. They ghost write articles in the medical journal and funnel them through third-party doctors that sign them for a fee to pump up the demand for a future drug that's coming on the market without disclosing that they've done just that. There are all kinds of tactics that have compromise the medical journals that our doctors rely on, thinking that they're getting good and pure information, and they're not.
I mean, that's shocking because for me, the medical journals are where I go to learn. Right, it's how I try to understand what scientists think, and I mean, I've been aware, of course, of the scandals in science, the replication crises, and they've affected medicine. But those you can kind of understand. They're like, scientists trying to like climb up the ladder of reputation or whatever, and they cut corners. Here, what you have is a systematic a systematic influence operation by the pharmaceutical industry on the medical literature itself. And just to go back to something we talked about earlier, the pharmaceutical companies they will attack doctors who find results that are contrary to their financial interests.
That's right. With really well-financed, organized campaigns. And I profile one of those in the book. I call this guy the Frog Professor, a Berkeley African-American professor who was hired by a chemical company to research a chemical that's pretty much in all of our drinking water today. It's used on a lot of crops. And he had the misfortune of finding in his research for the chemical company that chemical turned, my words, boy frogs into girl frogs and has all kinds of other adverse events and problems. The company, of course, because they control the terms under which these academics can publish, wouldn't let him publish the findings, tried to silence him. He quit, to his credit, and independently repeated the research so that he could publish it. There have been dozens, if not hundreds, of studies that have built upon that for the past 20 years, finding all kinds of adverse events. But the campaign the company went on to destroy this man for finding out this information is shocking and very instructive. From following him to speeches and intimidating him and researching him and his wife, to calling his bosses at Berkeley and trying to get him fired, to buying search terms on Google, which is why you can't find what you might really be looking for if you Google things because the searches are so manipulated. They made it where if you Google this guy's research or the chemical, if he came up at all, he would look like he was discredited, or he wouldn't come up, and instead the chemical company's own studies that it did publish would come up that seemed to prove the opposite. So I think that's really enlightening how the companies have these organized and super well-financed campaigns. Also, the system of third parties they use, third-party scientists and nonprofits and journalists that they get to write op-eds and defenses of their chemicals and drugs. You never know that necessarily they're connected to the drug company. They're writing what look like independent articles saying, gosh, the critics are all wet, this stuff is good. But so many of these people have direct financial links to the companies.
I mean, there are places to go for people to check if your doctor is how much money your doctor has taken from drug companies. There's a site called openpayments.gov, where there's supposed to be sort of open reporting, so you can type your own doctor's name in and see. I think that transparency is really helpful, but I just want to end with the sort of the last kind of thought. What do we do about this? What your book, this Follow the Science book, what it documents is a shocking corruption of the entire American institutional infrastructure, aimed at making sure that drug company interests are served and not people's interests are served. How do you go about fixing something so entwined in our society?
It's not easily fixable. I mean, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. probably, being a lawyer who's litigated against the government on some drug injury cases and vaccine injuries and understands where the corruption lies, he probably comes the closest to understanding what could be done, but will he be able to move this behemoth, turn this ship that should have been starting to be steered in a different direction 40 years ago? It's going to be very tough. But there are things individual people can do. And number one, having the information, understanding. I kind of try to take people on the journey I did, where I used to trust and believe everything a doctor told me. My dad's a doctor. My brother's a doctor. There are great doctors out there, but I used to also believe everything the government told me. And I thought they couldn't lie and they couldn't put information on the CDC website that wasn't true. I take people along the journey to start to understand how I picked someone like you pretty early on as a good source, as did probably the listeners and the watchers of your program. But there's a process you can use of critical thinking to expose yourself to other information that will help improve your health and cut through this information juggernaut. But secondly, there are individual things you can do, such as I encourage people to report their own potential medicine and vaccine adverse events. Federal databases are supposed to gather these. Your doctor's supposed to report them. But since most doctors don't even ask, or you may not even be tying something that you have to an adverse event, this stuff goes undiscovered for far too long when they should be patterns that are reported so that government officials or independents like me can look through. I broke the story about Viagra causing blindness internationally by looking through, in part, adverse event reports. So these things are important. They're things individuals can do, and there's some more tips in the book that I think will help people take control of their own health.
Well, Sharyl, thank you for spending so much time with me on. And I encourage listeners to go buy Sharyl's new book, Follow the Science, Sharyl Atkinson's new book. Sharyl, thank you for writing the book, and thank you for your reporting. I've learned so much from you over the years, and I'm so grateful to be able to talk with you today.
Likewise. Thanks, Jay.
Until next time, this is Professor Jay Bhattacharya talking to Sharyl Attkisson on the Illusion of Consensus podcast.